Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The United Nations is currently engaged in a major fundraising drive. Breitbart reports that the cash-strapped United Nations has issued an unprecedented global appeal for funds, claiming Wednesday it needs an immediate injection of $29 billion of global taxpayer money as climate change and global conflicts pressure existing budgets. But they have their work cut out for them. It's December, it's cold, and they have to convince people that the Arctic is melting and everybody is burning up. It might be difficult to convince this person that he's in danger from the heat. It doesn't seem like a well-thought-out marketing campaign. They probably should have done this back in July. The UN ran a very similar fundraising campaign 30 years ago in 1989. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea level if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. Well, they must have been successful 30 years ago because the world didn't end and we're all still here. Let's take a look at their current marketing campaign. The Arctic is one of their favorite props for global warming propaganda. Very few people have actually been to the Arctic, so most people have no idea what Arctic weather is supposed to be like. The UN can make climate alarmists crazy by simply showing them pictures of what the Arctic looks like every single summer. Now let's look at the real Arctic instead of the imaginary one painted by the United Nations. This is the map of Arctic ice extent for yesterday from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. It shows that the Arctic is actually full of ice. Taking a look at the longer term, this graph shows Arctic sea ice extent for every day going back to the start of MASI records in January of 2006. MASI stands for the Multi-Agency Sea Ice Index. The red line is the 365-day mean. It shows that there's been almost no change in average sea ice extent over the past 13 years. In other words, United Nations claims that the Arctic has been melting over the past decade are simply not true. Now let's look at what's going on in Greenland, which is another favorite propaganda prop for climate alarmists. The blue line shows the increase in surface mass of the Greenland ice sheet since September 1st of this year. You can see that more than 200 billion tons of new snow has accumulated on Greenland's surface, and it's slightly above normal, which is the gray line. These graphs are from the Danish Meteorological Institute, who are the experts on Greenland. On one day in November, 10 billion tons of new snow fell on Greenland. For some reason, that wasn't reported by the press. This graph shows the surface mass balance of Greenland for the past 3 years. Last year had below normal snow accumulation on Greenland's surface, but the previous 2 years were well above normal. The net accumulation of snow on Greenland's surface over the past 3 years has been well above normal. Once again, this is something which hasn't been reported by the press. UN claims that the Arctic is rapidly melting down are simply not true. Now let's move on to their claims about heat waves. They say that this decade is the hottest in history and that we're all going to burn up in extreme heat waves. Once again, this is complete nonsense. These graphs are from the National Climate Assessment and they show the exact opposite. The length of heat waves has declined sharply since the 1930s. Heat wave magnitude has declined sharply since the 1930s, as has the warmest temperature. There's no indication that extreme heat is getting worse. Quite the opposite, in fact. These claims from the United Nations have no basis in fact. Let's look now at the data in more detail. In the United States, the frequency of 95 degree Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius days has plummeted over the past century. This graph shows the January 1st to November 30th average maximum temperature at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations going back to the year 1895. This year is shown over on the right side of the graph, and you can see that this year is shaping up to be one of the 5 coolest years on record in the United States. This next graph shows the percent of days above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see once again that this year is one of the coolest on record. Also note how 60 years ago, the percent of days over 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the United States dropped sharply and never recovered. There is zero indication that heat waves are getting worse. Now we're going to look at the last 2 months of very cold weather in the United States. This graph shows average maximum temperatures in the United States just during October and November. Last October and November was the coolest on record in the United States, and this year is also shaping up to be one of the 10 coolest. All of the data isn't in yet, but when it arrives, 2019 will drop down a little bit. This map from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration High Plains Regional Climate Center shows just how cool the United States has been. More than 80% of the country has been below normal temperature over the past 2 months, much of it far below normal. And the long-term forecasts for the rest of the year are also looking quite cold. This current map from Rutgers University shows that there's a large excess in snow cover in the northern hemisphere right now. The blue dots represent places where there's currently snow now where it doesn't normally exist this time of year. And the red dots show the exact opposite. But you can see that there's a lot more blue dots than there are red dots. This indicates a large excess of snow cover. What causes this is Arctic air spilling away from the poles towards the equator. When we have excess coverage of snow like this year, it tells us that Arctic air is spilling down to lower latitudes than it does during an average year. This graph, also from Rutgers University, shows that autumn snow cover has been greatly increasing over the past 50 years. This year's autumn snow cover was the 6th highest on record. Last year was the 7th highest, and 5 years ago was the highest snow extent on record. If we just look at North America, this year's autumn snow cover was 3rd highest on record, and last year was the highest on record. This snow cover data correlates very closely with the temperature graphs I just showed you. Last October and November was the coolest on record in the United States, and we've also had a lot of snow. It's pretty obvious to most people that snow is associated with cold, but climate alarmists want you to believe the exact opposite. Having failed at all of their previous forecasts of the demise of snow, now they're trying to claim that the snow is caused by global warming. They claim that disappearing sea ice is the cause of the record cold and snow. We're going to look at that claim in a minute, but first let's look at the southern hemisphere. This week brought the coldest summer day on record to Australia. Coldest summer day on record, Wednesday, December 4th, 2019. Australia's lowest summer daily maximum temperature record was broken this week. A surge of unseasonably cold air swept over southeast Australia during the opening days of summer. This air mass produced thick snow in parts of Tasmania, Victoria, and New South Wales, and held daytime temperatures as much as 15 degrees below average in some places. Image: snow at Mount Hotham on December 2nd, 2019. So these cold polar air masses are not only surging towards lower latitudes in the northern hemisphere, but the same thing is occurring in the southern hemisphere too. Now let's look at this claim that disappearing sea ice is causing all this cold and snowy weather. This graph shows winter average maximum daily temperatures at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations over the past century. The red line is the 3-year mean, and you can see that the coldest period of winter temperatures in the United States was during the years 1977, 1978, and 1979. This next graph is very similar, except it shows the mean daily temperature instead of the maximum daily temperature. Once again, you can see that the winters of 1977, 1978, and 1979 were by far the coolest on record. Climate alarmists are trying to tell us now that cold, snowy winters are caused by missing Arctic sea ice. But during the coldest winter of 1979, Arctic sea ice extent was actually at a record high. This chart combines the Arctic sea ice graphs from the 1985 DOE report with the one from the 1990 IPCC report. And there is 1979 right there, the highest extent of the last century. So in 1979, high sea ice extent was associated with cold, snowy weather. But now climate alarmists are trying to claim the exact opposite, that cold, snowy weather is caused by low sea ice extent. Let's look at National Geographic from November 1977, the year the weather went wild. Florida's citrus crop got completely frozen. The Northeast had massive amounts of snow and cold during January of 1977. This is someone digging their car out of the snow in Buffalo, New York. It snowed in Miami during January of 1977, the only time it's ever snowed there, and Alaska was actually warmer than Florida. National Geographic correctly explained the weather as being associated with a large ridge in the jet stream over Alaska and a large dip over the eastern United States. They said, errant jet stream brings freakish weather. Remember that Arctic sea ice extent was very close to a record high in 1977. Now fast forward to the present. Climate alarmists are trying to blame the exact same pattern in the jet stream on missing Arctic ice and global warming. The picture on the left shows us what the global warming missing Arctic sea ice jet stream looks like. And the picture on the right shows us what the global cooling excess Arctic sea ice jet stream looks like. It looks exactly the same. According to climate alarmists, the symptoms of global warming and global cooling are identical. This is a dead giveaway that these climate alarmists have absolutely no clue what they're talking about. When the weather doesn't cooperate with their prior predictions, they simply make up new fake ad hoc theories to explain the most recent weather. What they're doing has nothing to do with science, it's simply propaganda. Let's look at some newspaper articles from the 1970s and 1980s. Chicago Tribune, March 2nd, 1975. Brr, new ice age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. The Guardian, January 29, 1974. Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. Newsweek, April 28, 1975. Climatologists wanted to stop global cooling by spreading soot on the Arctic in order to melt the polar ice cap. Chicago Tribune, November 25, 1981. Climatologists now blame recurring droughts and floods on a global cooling trend that could trigger massive tragedies for mankind. Note that the language is essentially identical to what the UN is using now, except that they use the term global cooling instead of global warming. The whole thing is a complete scam. 20 years ago, climate scientists were predicting the demise of snow. But then when we started getting a lot of snow a few years later, they said, cold snow proved global warming. So according to climate alarmists, no snow proves global warming, and lots of snow also proves global warming. No matter what the weather is, it's proof of global warming. And whether it's global cooling or global warming, their solution is always the same. In 1975, during the peak of the Ice Age scare, President Obama's future science advisor John Holdren wanted to shut down the U.S. energy supply. He said the United States is threatened far more by the hazards of too much energy too soon than by the hazards of too little too late. So apparently Holdren believed that the possibility of people freezing to death in the dark would not be a problem. And when he became Obama's science advisor, he was promoting the same policies of shutting down the energy supply, only it was under the guise of global warming instead of global cooling. The Union of Concerned Scientists says, defend science, donate now. We made important gains this year, but as long as science deniers and industry insiders hold power, we can't stop fighting for the policies and democracy we deserve. So the Union of Concerned Scientists is calling the world's greatest living physicist, Freeman Dyson, who's a climate skeptic, a science denier. And they're also calling tens of thousands of other brilliant scientists, people like Harrison Schmitt, the only scientist to have walked on the moon, science deniers. This sort of disgusting behavior is being used by people like the United Nations and the Union of Concerned Scientists to scare people in order to raise funding. Their heinous behavior needs to be exposed, and that's why I'm doing what I do. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.